Welcome to Money in Your Entrepreneurial Pursuit. This is the first of 2024's Get Savvy, Grow Your Green Stuff webinars for our webinar series. My name is Andrea Pellegrini, and I run the University of Illinois Systems Student Money Management Center, and I am joined by our subject matter expert, Steve Bob from UIC Business. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Good afternoon. I work at UIC in the College of Business and help entrepreneurs. And I'm happy to be sharing more information about money in your entrepreneurial pursuit today.
Thank you so much, Steve. So collectively, the Get Savvy webinar team represents organizations across the state of Illinois, which rest on the ancestral lands of multiple Native nations, including the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasha nations. And we have a responsibility to acknowledge these Native nations and to work with them as we move forward as a vibrant and inclusive society. Another thing we're going to be using a little bit today is the poll. So I'm going to launch a poll here. If I can find it again. And we just want to know who is joining us today. We want to know a little bit about your age, or age range, not your specific age, whether you're a student or employee, your gender, whether what your race is and ethnicity, and all that demographic information helps our colleagues in Extension to maintain funding for doing educational outreach like what we're partnering on today. So that information is not required, but it is very helpful for our partners to maintain funding. Plus, it gives us a little bit of an idea of how to modify some of our examples throughout today's webinar to better meet your needs. All right, so we got about 80% of people that have participated so far. It looks like we have a very broad age range of people joining us. We have students, employees, retired folks. We have both female and male people joining us, and a pretty diverse race and ethnicity. So I'm going to end the poll. Here's the results real quick so you can see. And I'm going to stop sharing the results so we can focus on our learning objectives. But if it doesn't close for you, you can go ahead and exit out of that window at the top. All right, so our learning objectives today, we want to help you identify different goals related to entrepreneurship. We're also going to explore what personal boundaries look like for risk, costs, and incomes related to business. We're also going to define funding options for starting your business, which can vary depending on your situation, what type of business that you have. And then we're also going to talk about strategies to balance personal and business finances simultaneously. With that last objective in mind, when it comes to starting a business, whether it's a side business or a full-time entrepreneurial endeavor, it can be kind of challenging to balance and separate personal finances from business finances. You'll need to generate enough income to cover both your costs as an individual, as well as business costs, but it's important to keep them separated. So most of what we're going to be discussing today will be focused on the entrepreneurial finances, but we want you to keep in mind that it's important to separate and balance both personal and business financial management. A lot of these things, when you start a business, you're taking on some risks, specifically risks related to the operations of the business. And in order to reduce the impact of those risks on you personally, it's really important to make sure that you keep your business life and your personal life appropriately separate. So some of that's going to differ depending on your risk tolerance, as well as your personal situation. It may be cheaper overall to bundle certain aspects of costs, or you might be using certain personal resources to help launch or sustain your business during different times, but keeping those things as separate as possible, especially when it comes to insurance and personal finances, accounts specifically, that's very helpful. So we'll continue to talk about this several times throughout the webinar today, especially as we're talking about entrepreneurial finances. So I'm going to hand it back over to, oh, I'm not going to hand it back over to Steve. I'm going to talk a little bit about what your goals are with entrepreneurship. So I talk a lot about goal setting in the context of personal finances, but we want to know, maybe in the chat, what are the reasons that you're thinking about entrepreneurship right now? You're here. There's roughly 30-ish people joining us today. We're talking about entrepreneurship. What are some of the reasons that you're thinking about entrepreneurship for yourself? Either maybe you already have a business, maybe you are just thinking you have a business idea and you want to explore what that looks like. What are some of the personal reasons that you're thinking about entrepreneurship? Family tradition, freedom and autonomy. I am very fond of freedom and autonomy. Security. So there's a lot of these are really great responses. Generate generational wealth, more income for the family. These are great responses. I'm going to keep things going. Please continue to share in the chat, though. These are really helpful. Oh, provide services for underrepresented groups, childhood passion. Excellent. So, here are just 8 of the many reasons someone may be pursuing entrepreneurship. You might want to create generational wealth, like somebody said. You want to address a need in your community. You want to pursue social justice or support nonprofits through your business. You want to generate additional income, maybe have a side hustle. Maybe you want to replace full-time employment. This is often called a lifestyle business. You might be looking for a way to change your current situation. Maybe you have a different way of doing something than what's historically been done or what's available in your area. Maybe you're looking to have more work-life balance. That is also related to a lifestyle situation. And like someone else said in the chat, maybe you're looking to be your own boss. You're looking for that freedom and autonomy to do something different, to follow your passion. So all these different reasons different things might be reasons that you are pursuing entrepreneurship. So once you've thought about kind of why you're looking at pursuing entrepreneurship, it's important to think about some of your financial goals. While making money is a common starting point, it isn't very specific, or it doesn't fit the classic model of what a SMART goal is. When we talk about SMART goals, we tend to talk about them being specific, measurable, achievable, or agreed upon, relevant, or timely. So in the context of SMART goals for business, you might want to research and identify costs or subtasks of your goal for making it measurable. Obviously, the more specific it is, the more likely you are to visualize it and make it easier to achieve. Helps you stay motivated. Deciding on whether a goal is realistic based on some of your other commitments or what resources you have access to. Is it relevant to your overall business goal or objective? And then that time piece is very important, whether it's personal finance goals or business goals. So, well, you might be kind of early in the process. It's pretty important to think about starting to make kind of broad targets and time frames and then narrow those things down. And here are just a few things to think about. So if your goal is to create generational wealth, you might make that a SMART goal by adding some time to it and make it a little more specific. So over the next 20 years, You want to build assets so I can provide a down payment on a house for each of my grandchildren. That's a lot more specific. It helps you visualize. If your goal is community need in a traditional sense, you might say, over the next 10 years, I'm going to build a business that employs X amount of workers. You want to put that measurable piece, how many workers you want, and pays living wages to them. For community need, if you're addressing social justice, you might say, over the next 10 years, I'm going to build an organization that is financially stable and addresses whatever that social justice need. That's that specific piece of the SMART goal. And then with additional income, you might say, in 3 months, I'll be spending 12 hours a week generating $700 in additional income. Um, and obviously, you can modify what that X and Y amount is to be more in line with what your specific goal is. If you want to do replacement income as part of your goal, you might say, within 9 months, income from my business will generate income for me of 70,000 a year, right? So that's very specific. And this is not all the goals that exist, but you can kind of figure out based on your personal objectives for starting a business what SMART goals look like for you. So kind of take the time to think about what is realistic in your situation. So there are other types of goal setting methods. The SMART goal method might not work for you. We actually provided, we discussed these 4 other alternative goal setting methods in a podcast, which Kwabena just put a link to in the chat. OKRs, or objectives and key results. This was popularized by Andy Grove in the 70s, in the 1970s. They just help you define clear objectives and measurable key results, kind of how the title explains. Let's say your objective is to increase net worth, if wealth generation is your plan. Since net worth is calculated by taking the value of all your assets minus the amount of your debt, key results could be things like paying off a credit card or increasing your monthly savings or contributions to a retirement account. So backward planning was discussed in a book by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. With backward planning, you just start with your ultimate goal. Maybe it's buying a space for your business, and then you work backward, breaking it into smaller actionable steps to make that more manageable, to turn that into turn your dream into something that's more manageable and achievable. WOOP, or WOOP, was developed by a psychologist named Gabriel Oettingen and some of her colleagues. And it stands for wish, outcome, obstacle, and plan. So you start with your wish, you envision the positive outcome, you identify potential obstacles, and then create a plan to overcome them. So that's another way to think about goal setting. The ABC method is rooted in behavior modification, so it's more relevant to personal finances, but since personal finance and business finance is often intertwined, this might be a good approach for you, or in combination with another approach. So this helps you understand the triggers or antecedents of your financial behaviors, helps you to understand the behaviors themselves and the consequences. This is a kind of a more mindful way to change your habits and achieve your financial goals. This can be really helpful if that's something that you struggle with. So the other thing to think about when you're creating a plan is to think about what can get in the way. So when it comes to behavioral economics, there's a lot of different biases out there that are recognized to influence our habits. The planning fallacy, which was mentioned in a 1977 paper by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, recognizes that we are notoriously bad at estimating the time required to accomplish a task, even when we have a lot of past experience failing to meet deadlines related to that particular type of task. So this happens because we tend to get tunnel vision and we ignore outside factors like the interruptions we're likely to get while completing a task or other external data. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about the time frame for a specific goal is you might need to think about consequences or potential factors outside of your control that might impact the time frame of accomplishing a goal. And the other thing to think about is that goals may shift. So, since there are many, many, many things outside of our control and things change, this is common. So, for example, the planning fallacy may cause you to move from a full time lifestyle business to a side hustle until you're able to get more clients. If you didn't anticipate how many clients you need for a sustainable income. Or you may want to move from a community support business and to building a legacy. Maybe that's how your goals shift related to your business. You can maintain the same business plan, but you might look at ways to scale your business a little bit differently. So it's important to think about how goals may shift, and that's okay. Having a plan just kind of makes it easier to transition between those shifts. That's where goal setting kind of comes in. And now I'm going to transition it to Steve to talk about how much you're willing to lose.
So it might seem like a strange question to think about when we're talking about money in your entrepreneurial pursuit, how much you might be willing to lose. But I think that there's some discipline and some value in thinking about the side of loss that could happen if we proceed with a business. Um, it's very important that we acknowledge that small businesses are risky. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the statistics that are out there that say that so many businesses will fail, but I think it's important that we do acknowledge that small business has its risk and entrepreneurship doesn't always work out the way we want it to. And so we need to be wise about that. Um, we also need to be careful about the fact that our energy and our passion that we put into this can cloud our judgment. And sometimes we make decisions because we get excited about something or because we're only looking at one side of the picture when maybe we need to just be aware and be cautious about that. And then I think many of us, and I certainly think about this a lot, what if I had just tried a little bit harder? What if I had just put in a little bit more energy? Would that have been what had pushed me over the top? And so it's important that we be aware of these risks and acknowledge that we each have a different tolerance for how we're going to address these different topics. Two things that I would encourage you to take seriously, think about that I believe will help entrepreneurs as they begin their journey and as they proceed down their process are one, to have a written business plan. I love this quote by General Eisenhower, and I use it all the time. Plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Um, I really do think that people who take the time to plan, something in them changes. And I'm not a psychologist. I don't want to study that type of thing too much, but I definitely can tell that people who I work with who are planners tend to be more successful. It doesn't guarantee success. I don't want you to think that just because you put together a beautiful written business plan, you will be successful. But I will tell you that in my experience of over 20 years working with entrepreneurs, planners tend to be more successful than non-planners. Um, and so I think that there's value in taking the time putting together a business plan. The other thing I would encourage you is find coaches, advisors, mentors, others to give you advice and support you as you go through the process. And as much as family is important, and I believe that you should have uh, support from your family members, hopefully they will support you. I also think that it's important that you have people who are a little more independent. And so, yes, you want to talk to those family, but you want to talk to people who have gone through the journey before, who have some other experiences. I strongly believe that having multiple perspectives can be really helpful. And ultimately, one of the challenges that I see so often in business is a phrase that I used to hear all the time and kind of got to hate, but it's really true. We don't know what we don't know. And I think one of the biggest things that coaches and advisors and mentors can bring to you is a different perspective and just say, hey, have you thought about that? Hey, I did it that way and that created this situation. Uh, is that good? Is that bad? How can you adjust to make this work in the best way for you? So it's important to build that network. And one of the things is I think our society has been taking entrepreneurship very seriously in the last few years, and I think there are more resources out there. So look for those resources to find those coaches, advisors, and mentors. As you're going through the process of identifying someone to give you advice, and again, I think you should have multiple people doing this, but I think it's worth taking a little bit of time to think about boundaries between a mentor and a mentee. Just because, in my experience, um, I, I'm a business consultant and I get asked occasionally to be a mentor, and I always kind of cringe at that word. Like, what does that mean? I think that a lot of people get a little nervous when they hear that, but I think a lot of people actually do want to help. And so setting clear expectations, you as the entrepreneur defining what assistance you're looking for, and knowing that yes, over time that's going to change, but are there specific areas of the entrepreneurial tasks that you feel like you need some additional resources? Identify those. Find out what the person you're talking to, what their experience and knowledge is, and what's important to them. How much time can they give you? How much freedom do they have to help you? And then set expectations so both sides of the relationship know what's going to happen and what's reasonable. Again, I think most people want to help, but maybe they don't have a lot of time, or maybe they do have more time. And so it's worth asking that question. And then also understanding the best way to communicate with them. I think that we each have our own ways that we prefer to communicate. And uh, it's hard when I love to send emails, but I don't really like to text, or I like to pick up the phone and make phone calls. What is it the person who you're talking to, what is it their preferred way of communicating so you can communicate and benefit from their advice and their suggestions? And something we didn't put on this slide that I'll just throw out there is remember that if you're the entrepreneur, you have to make the decisions. And sometimes we want somebody else to tell us what to do. And know that I would say good consultants, good mentors don't necessarily tell you what to do, but they help you explore options. And then you have to decide what's right, what is best for your situation. The last thing in this section that I want to talk about is I think it's worth taking a little bit of time to think a little bit about when you're going to call it quits. And the reality is, there are a number of different ways that sometimes I see entrepreneurs decide that maybe it's time to make a change. And they're all very specific and very personal issues. But I think it's healthy to, as we're thinking about what this means to me, what entrepreneurship is going to be like, is what is going to help me make the decision when it's time to maybe say, you know what, this isn't working. Let's move on to something else. So some things just to think about: goals change. In many ways, life has its way of changing things, and we see things from different perspectives. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. Uh, I would encourage entrepreneurs to think about how many resources they can commit, both time. A lot of time we think about resources as financial, but there will be a time when maybe we have to say, hey, we're not going to go any farther into this. Is that debt, or is it using a resource that you've saved and you only want to use a certain amount? Um, and then also be aware that there will be external challenges. One of the things that I see with entrepreneurs time and time again is that often the topic that they come to me and they say, hey, I want to do this specifically. A gentleman came to me a couple years ago and said, I want to start a restaurant. I've spent a lot of time with him over the last couple of years. We don't ever talk about food. Now, part of that is just because that's not my area of expertise, but the reality is running a business, there are a lot of other issues. There are HR issues. There are licensing issues with the municipality where you work with. There are taxing issues. There are regulatory issues that might affect certain types of businesses. And so there can be a lot of external challenges. And again, it's good to kind of think about how am I going to address those, and what are some flags that I might use to help me know, hey, I've done the best I can, and it's time to call it quits. Hopefully that is helpful. Let's move on and start to think about another important question. How much do you need to start your business? I think it's important that we understand some basic accounting terminology. And I know that accounting might sound like a strange world and a strange set of language. It is its own way of doing things. And I think that good entrepreneurs take the time to learn to understand the basics of accounting. And so here are just a couple of things, some terminology that accountants will use that I think is really helpful for entrepreneurs to understand. Uh, they have five categories or areas where they classify money resources. And so the first one are assets, things that you or your company own. And if we look at the picture there, that's a tractor out in a field. A farmer probably has bought a tractor, and realistically, that might be a very expensive tractor. And so the next thing is liabilities, things you own or the company, things that you owe. I'm sorry, I always get those words are so easy to get confused. Owns and owes. Um, and so if someone was buying a tractor, they probably wouldn't have the money to pay for it up front. So they're probably going to have to take out some debt to do that. And so they owe money on those assets typically. Um, when we think about accounting, we're going to talk about some financial statements in a second. Another term that is related to these two is equity, is the value of those assets. So if, say, just hypothetically, I paid $400,000 for a tractor, but hey, I had to borrow $300,000 for it, the equity, the value of that, if I sold it and I paid off that loan, would be roughly $100,000. And ultimately, I would encourage you to remember that really what we want to be looking at in a business is how much equity we have. Certainly, as we talked about the different types of business and the different reasons for going into business, there are different ways to think about this. But the value of the business is really what is the equity? We take away what we own and we and pay off those loans, and what do we get left? Then we also want to be aware of the income, what comes into the business, and the expenses, the money that goes out to pay for the cost to make that business work. And so those are five basic areas of accounting terminology that you will deal with a lot. On our next slide here, there are three financial reports that are very important for business people to be aware of and to start to be aware of in your entrepreneurial journey. So the first one is what's called a balance sheet, and that is a list of the assets, of the liabilities, and the equity. So it's a list of what we own, a list of what we owe, and then it tells us what the difference is. A balance sheet is always looking at the way things were at a specific date and time. So very commonly, especially as we're beginning a new year, what was the balance sheet as of the end of December 31st? That's a very common date to see a balance sheet. Sometimes we look at the balance sheet at the end of every month. Sometimes maybe it's at the end of the quarter. But again, it's where things were on that specific day. And there's a formula, and that's, I think, where the word balance comes from here. The assets equals the liabilities plus the equity. So the amount that somebody owns should equal the amount that they owe plus the balance that remains on those, the equity. Another statement is the profit and loss. Uh, I don't think I can't ever remember hearing a different name for a balance sheet, but there are a couple of different names for a profit and loss. Sometimes people call it a P&L, sometimes call it an income and expense statement. Those are the most common ones, but sometimes that's confusing. So a P&L, a profit and loss, or an income and expense statement, those all really refer to the same financial statement. And on this statement, we list the income. Typically, that's at the top. And then below that, we typically have a listing of the expenses. And those are typically listed in categories to kind of simplify. So we wouldn't list every single expense in terms of buy the specific item, but we would categorize those. So amounts that we earned maybe selling one product, maybe we have two or three products, so we'd list those each on different lines, how much money came in. And then on our expenses, how much we paid for rent, how much we paid in salaries, how much we paid for insurance, for the telephone or communication technology, various other expenses that we need to run the business. Typically, a profit and loss is looking at a period of time. So, how much money did we spend? How much money came in and how much money went out over last year, or over last quarter, or over last month. Then the third financial statement, and one that's a little less common, but I actually think is probably one of the most important, is what's called a cash flow statement. And a cash flow statement really is just looking at how cash flows in and out of the business. The reality is while we talk about how the balance sheet needs to equal out, and that's true in accounting, the most important factor in most businesses is, do they have enough money to continue to operate? Are they bringing in money? Is there money to pay those bills so that they will continue to be doing that the next day and the next day after that? And so a cash flow statement allows you to look at that and actually understand where that's going and what the impact are on the different categories, the five things we just talked about on the previous slide, how those all affect cash. Because in reality, if you don't have cash, you're going to be in big trouble in your business, and that will cause you to end up having to close shop and probably call bankruptcy. So I encourage us to think about planning a cash flow statement. In the chat, we've just added a link to a sample cash flow statement that I use. It's one of those things I will say it often looks a little cryptic if you haven't looked at one before. And this is probably one of those places where having advisors and others who you can talk to about the math typically is not very complicated. The projections, the thoughts, those get a little more complicated. I know that you can figure this out if you put some time into it. Typically, when we do cash flow statements, we want to use them to think about different ways to think about the impact of different ways that could be affected in the business. So we can look at different scenarios. It's not uncommon to hear someone say, "Well, have you done a worst case and a best case scenario and kind of the best what we hope for?" Looking at good and bad situations and what impact that has again on cash. Um, what if someone is willing to invest different amounts? Maybe someone says, "Hey, I'll give you that much money." And it's like, well, is that enough? Well, the cash flow can help us see that. What if we find another investor who can put a little bit of money in? Uh, we can also look at it based on seeing how much the interest rate is and how that's going to impact. And I recently heard from one of my entrepreneurs that the increase in interest rates is really having an impact on her. We probably could have planned that out a few months ahead of time and listening to the plans and at least having some ideas. And then, do investors have different returns that they're looking for? And so again, these are different things that as we think through our financial planning and putting together a cash flow statement, we can start to plan for. One of the things that entrepreneurs often talk a lot about is the business side of their business, and that's super important. But it's also important, especially as a owner, to think about how much money does the business need to pay you to cover your personal expenses? And ultimately, what are your personal expenses? Um, I think that having a personal budget is really important. And it's great that the Get Savvy series has a number of tools to help you think about that and has talked about that in a number of times. And it's always scary to me when an entrepreneur comes in and we start to talk about how much return they're going to expect, and they say they haven't really thought about that and they don't know how much money they need. It's just like a lender, an investor wants to know what their return is going to be. You're going to need to know what your expenses are. Um, a lender or an investor aren't going to want to say, "Hey, we'll fund this business," and then find out that you don't know how much money you need to pay your own expenses. So Another thing to think about from this, how much money do you need, is the whole issue of business taxes. And I know there's always lots of discussion on the re- reasonableness of taxes. Uh, Certainly, there's political discussion there that we don't need to go into. But as a person looking at entrepreneur, there's some basic things I think you need to be aware of. I would say that one of the advisors you need for your business is somebody who's an accountant who's probably got what's called a CPA designation. A uh, uh, now it's slipping my mind what the CPA stands. Hopefully, someone can put
Certified
that.
public accountant.
Thank you, certified
You're
public
welcome.
accountant. Somebody who's studied that and who can really help you think through those implications. Sometimes those implications are actually pretty straightforward. Other times people have complicated family situations or other situations and it can get rather complicated. So accountants really help with those issues. Uh, I would estimate that you should plan somewhere between 25 and 35% of your income will go to taxes. I know that that might sound a little shocking, but for many people, and certainly you need to do your own research on this, but many people pay about 12% of their income in taxes. Uh, the self-employment tax provisions require that you set aside just over 15%. There is a credit for half of that, but again, you need to be prepared for that. And then the state of Illinois, we pay about 5% of our income in state taxes. So that adds up to just over 30%. So that's not too far off. Certainly, you can talk about ways to minimize your taxes, but this is a starting point. And something else just to think about, kind of a side note there. Some people have gotten in trouble when they try to go to a bank to get a loan because their taxes show a loss year after year after year. And again, that's something to discuss with your accountant and figure out how do we show these records in the most appropriate way that will help me through those issues. And then the last thing, if we can go back one slide, one last thing, uh, business owners pay their taxes quarterly. So most of us are used to being employees, where every time we get paid, our employer withholds a little bit of money and sends that to the federal government. Uh, in most cases, business owners are actually not employees, and so they're responsible to pay what are called estimated taxes. And actually, those are not on a quarterly basis. There's one time a year where it's a little bit different, the length of time. But yes, it generally is quarterly, and you'll need to have that money ready to make those payments. And if you want to learn more about that, if you look up estimated taxes, the form typically is a 1040 ES. There are a couple of variations about that, but they tend to have ES on the end, is where you can learn more about that. Or, of course, go back to your accountant. So, as we think about how much you will need, one, I would definitely encourage you slow down. Uh, Take some time to do some planning. The comment, don't try to build the plane as you fly it. You will have days as an entrepreneur where you feel like you're doing that, but you have in order to fly, you're going to have some kind of a structure to sit and some wings to pick you up. So you've got to have some kind of a structure there. And then as you plan your budget, um, it's hard, but beware that you don't underestimate your expenses and be cautious that you don't overestimate your income. That's always Both of those are always a challenge, and going back to having advisors look at it, I think is super helpful. So let's move on to some different funding options. So uh, if we can go to the next slide. So there are a couple of types of funding option we're going to talk about. We have a poll that we want to throw up here. Just if you've thought about a type of funding option for your business, and this is just to give us some ideas of what different people are thinking about. So can you put the poll up, Andrea?
I did. I don't know if you can see it as a co-host, but we have roughly 20% of people have
Uh,
responded so far. Um, and you can choose multiple answers. So you might have a combination of these things that you're looking at or thinking about. Looks like a lot of people are considering bootstrapping, fewer are using crowdfunding, some are looking at grants, some are thinking about loans. So
cool. So let's dig into some of these.
All right, I'm sharing the results so you can kind of see, hopefully you can see what the distribution is. And I'll stop sharing and we can talk about bootstrapping.
Cool. So bootstrapping and savings. So we've kind of lumped these two together. Uh, the concept of bootstrapping, I think, comes out of the old lore of the Old West, where the cowboys would pull themselves up by their bootstrap. So how do we do that in the business world? Well, there are a couple ideas that different people have used basically to pull themselves up. Some people use employment income, so maybe they've got a job and they're starting their business on the side. And so maybe every time they get paid, they put a little bit of money. Maybe it's buying some assets for the business. Maybe it's buying some tools, some equipment, some additional inventory. Uh, Another thing that's very common is entrepreneurs who continue to put their profits back in the business. So instead of taking that money out, maybe they might need to pay themselves a small salary, but they hope that someday they'll be able to pay themselves a larger salary. But for now, all those profits go back in the business and are used to continue to grow it. Um, some people have access to personal credit, especially a very common thing is to use credit cards. Uh, be careful about that. Credit card debt can be very expensive, um, but it is a very common thing. There was a statistic that I had seen a number of years ago that at least 12% of entrepreneurs admit to using personal credit cards. My guess is that that's a very low number, that in reality it's much higher. Some people commit to putting money away or have money saved that they can use, or maybe there are people in their family who would be willing to support it. So, kind of a traditional story that you hear is someone went to their grandparents and said, "Hey, would you help me with some money for my business?" And so, friends and family is not unusual. Not everybody is in that position, and so that might or not might be an option for you. One thing specifically around friends and family is I encourage you to make sure that you put it in writing what your plan is. And so that everybody is clear. Is this a loan? Is this a gift? Um, is this needing to be repaid? We've just passed the holidays, but a holiday dinner with a family would be mighty uncomfortable if grandma thought she was giving you a loan and you thought she was giving you a gift. And she was thinking to herself, when is my business owner going to start paying me returns? And you're thinking, it was so nice of grandma to give me this money and I don't ever need to repay it. So important to put that in writing just to clarify for everybody what the expectation is. One of the things about these methods is in general, you are not giving up ownership in your business. And so you continue to be the owner. And as you move into some of the other funding options, if say you were going to go get a loan after this, it would show that you've put your own skin in the game. And most lenders don't want to lend you the full amount of money. They want to give you a part of it and know that you've got skin in the game. Crowdfunding, uh, not so popular in our poll here, but I talk to a lot of people who have an idea of using crowdfunding, generating support for a product from strangers. And we use the word product there. I mean, this can also be for services, although it is more common with products. But many of us have heard about Kickstarter, Indiegogo, GoFundMe, different common platforms that are pretty well known where people put ideas. I've got this product, give me some money. I was just looking at one this morning just because I was doing a little bit of research, and an extension for a game computer that supposedly makes it more convenient to play certain types of computer games. So you put a price out, you hope to raise enough money, and then you use that to fund your getting your product started. The reality is this has become a pretty sophisticated process, and I would encourage that you come up with a plan of how you're going to do this. You probably need a large social network, because while it sounds like, hey, this platform will promote me, they only can promote so many ideas a day. So you typically have to be really good at marketing, and this is just one of the processes that you use to get the word out there. And um, most of these tools have a certain expectation about how much time you can have a campaign open. Um, and so you really need to think about that and be wise about the amount of money. I've had way too many conversations with people who say, "Oh, I'm going to raise $100,000. Oh, I'm going to raise $1 million on a crowdfunding project." And yes, there are projects that do raise large amounts of money, but in reality, most raise quite a bit less. Kickstarter actually has a statistics page if you want to learn more. But I've been following this for a number of years, and the average campaign on Kickstarter that is successful, I believe, is in the $30,000 range. So understanding what your goal is that enough money, and how we're going to make that work is really important. Uh, Often hear there must be government grants out there, or there are government grants. Um, the reality is, yes, there are, but the reality is that many of them are very difficult. Um, the reality is most of them have a very specific niche. Um, Most of them are relatively competitive. I just looked at one this morning. There's a grant application in the Chicagoland area right now. They're actually only giving 25 grants out, which might sound like a lot, but if you think that there are probably, hundreds of thousands of businesses in Chicagoland, the odds are relatively low. Most grants have a relatively extensive application process. The process typically involves a lot of writing. Now, there are some that are a little bit easier, but I would encourage you to think about the energy involved and the chances of success, and decide if it really makes sense for you to apply for that. There are a couple legitimate grants that I always like to bring up. Um, the first one is the federal SBIR and STTR program, and because many of us are on a university campus, it's important that we be aware of this, because this is a way that the government funds a lot of research, and many times there are students who I'm talking to, professors who are doing some kind of research that the government might be willing to do some funding for. Now, I will also say it is a tough process, and in terms of that extensive application requirement, SBIR and STTR's application is probably one of the more complicated, and off the top of my head, I would say that it's like writing a 40 to 60 page paper to apply for that type of grant. So it's a lot of work. Chicago has a program called TechRise, which is supporting historically underrepresented tech businesses. And if you're in the tech industry, I would encourage you to check out TechRise. The other real quick note about TechRise, they typically do pitch competitions every Friday. They've been around for 3 years, and every Friday from about April to October, they do a pitch competition, and they have their requirements, but I think for entrepreneurs, it's worth listening to other people pitch. And so that's a way to see other pitches. And so even if you're not in the tech industry, it might be worth checking it out. And then the last one, and thanks for putting these in the chat. If you're in the city of Chicago proper and you're looking for physical space, the city has a program in certain neighborhoods. It's very specific, but in certain neighborhoods to pay for certain physical improvements to rental space or own space. So if you had a building that needs a new roof or needs a new air conditioning system, there might be an option for that. Again, very specific rules, not applicable. If you want to have a store on the Magnificent Mile, then that's probably not an option. But if you're a car repair place and you're willing to move into a neighborhood that maybe has had some challenges over time, and that's less important to your customers, then maybe getting some improvements to that building would be a possibility through the SPIF program. Um, I have done some research, and as far as I know, there's no other municipalities doing the SPIF program, but there might be some one out there. So I do encourage you to be alert for grants, but know that they are a challenging way to get money. And then moving on to loans. So traditionally, loans are pretty difficult to obtain. One of the things is you've probably heard about the words an SBA guaranteed loan. The Small Business Administration at the federal government does not make small business loans. They provide guarantees to financial institutions like your local bank to hopefully make the process a little bit easier. it's still a complicated process, and it's still the bank that makes the decision of who to make the loan to. It's not the government. It's the guarantee is to reduce the risk for the financial institution. So the statistics that I've got suggest that only about 20% of small businesses get loans because they are difficult. Two or three things here. You probably will be required to sign a personal guarantee. I've actually never found a lender that doesn't require you to personally sign off. And it basically says, if this business doesn't succeed, I'm still going to pay off this loan. Um, Most lenders want to see you generating revenue before they'll lend to you. And the reality is most, especially traditional, the big banks, even most of the community banks, they want to see 2 years of tax returns with a profit in each of those years for them to be willing to make loans. So loans are a challenge. They're not impossible, but they do take some hard work. The last category, and I'm just throwing this up here because I hear a lot about it, but angels, sometimes called angel investors, venture capitalists, sometimes called VCs, or selling equity, selling stock in a company. Um, these are things that sometimes get some interesting press. Um, the reality is very few entrepreneurs actually get funded by these. I think the number is less than 1%. Every once in a while, there's some statistics that say it's a little bit higher, but it is a pretty low amount. They have very high expectations, typically in excess of 10 times their investment. So it's not 10%, it's 10x. So if they put $1,000 in your business, they're looking probably in 3 to 5 years to be able to take out $10,000. And often the process is long, slow, and complicated. But if you're having a high growth business, one that's going to grow really fast, certainly check out the options. So, one quick plug for myself here is I do a series of workshops on entrepreneurship, and we'll be starting again in February. And hopefully, the link is in there. There's a code for people who are affiliated with the university. So, if you're a student or on staff, there's a code there that will let you register for free. We do ask that alumni pay for the fee. We hope that you're have a little bit more resources and community members are welcome to join us, but we also ask that they pay the fee. But during the February 20th session, I will spend a lot more time talking about these funding opportunities and things to think about related to that. So moving on to business costs and income. Um, it's really important to be thinking about how much money is going to be coming into your business and what are the expenses going out. I think that the most important way to do that is to use the cash flow projection tool. And I find that when I work with entrepreneurs, I think that entrepreneurs need to have a spreadsheet where they keep track of money that's coming in and the expenses. Now, they might have some kind of another system. We'll talk about that in a couple seconds, but putting together a cash flow projection and then using that on an ongoing basis, I think is really important and will help them. And they're also putting together the traditional financial statements, the three statements we talked about earlier, and putting those together in projection format for the next couple years. That's a little bit complicated, but is also a valuable resource and takes time, but is worth doing. In my experience, many lenders, not every lender, but almost every lender will, if you are going to get a 3-year loan, they're going to want to see 3 years of projections. If you're getting a 5-year, they probably want 5 years. Now, if you're getting a longer loan than that, they'll probably stop at about 5 years, but not every lender is going to do that. And so you do have to take the time to put together those projections. Um, it's always good to have a record keeping system. So a couple of ideas here. Ultimately, I think that your record keeping system should be the system that works for you. And certainly as you get more sophisticated, you'll probably want a more sophisticated system, but there are lots of different ways to do it. And while this isn't directly related to the money in your business, many entrepreneurs need some kind of a point of sale system or maybe some kind of a system to track appointments. And so that's something that you would want to think about as you're doing that. Can those all be integrated together? Um, we're getting short on time, so I'm going to go through a couple things really quick here. As a business owner, you need to be careful with the data you're storing, both the electronic data and the paper data. So, being aware of cybersecurity issues, it is a big issue, and I would encourage you to not say if I'm going to get hacked, it's when I'm going to get hacked and how I'm going to plan for that. Um, and as a business owner, if you have client information, you're at a higher there's a higher expectation for you to handle that. There are legal requirements around the different records you need to keep, say specifically but not exclusively, but say the employment records if you have employees, how long you must keep those records. And then where are you going to keep that paperwork and how are you going to keep it? Um, just because we mentioned waterproofing a number of years ago, some of you might remember, some of you might not, but in 1992, I was just looking at this, the Chicago River flooded into a series of tunnels under the city, and many businesses' records were destroyed in that flooding. Um, so things to be careful about. Next slide. As you're thinking about your costs, the world is a challenging place. Some things that have impacted businesses recently that, again, probably can't necessarily plan for, but I would encourage you to think about, what can I do to minimize my risk? So the pandemic had an issue. Um, we live in a world that's impacted by politics, and so tariffs continue to come up. And then supply chain, two things related to supply chain. In 91, there was a boat that got stuck in the Suez Canal for 6 days. And one of the things is 5% of the world's transportation goes through the Suez Canal and had a big impact on not just the boat that got stuck, but the boats that were in the canal on either side of the boat that got stuck that people couldn't get their stuff through. And just in the last week, I saw a headline that the Panama Canal is going to have to reduce shipping by a third because there's not enough water flowing through there, and so they've got to cut back shipping. So again, 5% of the world's trade goes through the Panama Canal, and so if you have goods that might be going through the Panama Canal, that's going to have an impact on the cost of those and the cost of shipping other goods. So, Andrea, I think you were going to take this.
I was, and my mute button went away. So thank you, Steve. I think that's very helpful. So again, coming back to balancing personal and business finances, it's important to know your risk tolerance when it comes to your personal and business risks and how you want to separate those. Um, the types of financial products you really want to focus on separating are your financial accounts, like your savings accounts and checking accounts. You need to have separate ones for personal expenses or savings goals and business expenses and savings goals. You might have multiple accounts for different categories, but you need to keep those separate. And then you also want to choose a business structure that protects your personal assets as much as it can. So research what is available to you and pick something that works with your risk tolerance, your business structure, business goals. We talked about mentors that would be good to pull in to think about how to structure business. In summary, when you're thinking about your finances, you don't want to ignore them, because if you ignore your finances, they will ignore you. So think about, what are your goals related to entrepreneurship or your business specifically. It's important to know what your personal boundaries are, like we talked about earlier when it comes to risk, your costs needs, and income needs, as well as understanding how to explore funding options to start your business. We talked about several. You could sign up for the venture series as well. And it's also important to know those different strategies that we talked about to balance personal and business finances simultaneously. And that might shift over time based on what your access to resources are. Our next webinar is Steps to Investing, What to Know Now. In just 3 weeks, on February 7th, we'll be joined by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, a couple representatives, to talk about investing now, because things are a little bit more volatile. So it's good to know what our options are. You can also watch some of our previous webinars on YouTube. and we'll stay on for a few more minutes if you have any questions, but you can also stay in contact with us. So, if you do have to go anywhere, again, this is being recorded, so we will send the recording out to anyone that registered, hopefully in the next few weeks. But if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We also have a Q&A feature in case you want to keep your question more anonymous. So, thank you for joining us again and have a fabulous afternoon.
I just put the link for the Venture series again with the code in there if you are part of the University of Illinois. I say UIC because that's my normal community, but really this is open to anybody at any University of Illinois schools. Um, so
Thank you, Steve. All right. Again, don't feel obligated to stay on. We will stick around for a little while if you have questions. If you think of questions later, you can always email studentmoney@uillinois.edu and we can try to get you an answer or get you connected with Steve. And hopefully that will help you get your question answered. I'm not seeing any questions. I don't know if Steve, you got some personal questions sent directly to you. Oh, Sarah asked, what do you think is the common reasons that businesses fail? So I think that's a Steve question.
sure. So, I mean, I really think there are lots of different causes. Probably the couple that I would be most concerned about is have you really done an analysis of what your customers want? And something that's sometimes talked about in the industry is customer discovery, actually going out and asking potential people who might buy what you're selling if they're interested. And part of customer discovery is trying to figure out how you can make yours different. So if you're selling a water bottle that's being produced by somebody else, you're just selling it because there you can't customize that too much. But if you're making, say, a program to help people, solve some need they have on the internet, then asking customers what do they need and trying to understand where we call it the gaps are in the market, where are other products not solving the problem so you can make sure that yours solves that problem. Um, so understanding your customers is a big thing. Having enough money. Uh, I hate to tell this to people, but it is true. Most entrepreneurs will tell you that it took at least twice as long and twice as much money as they expected. The reality is that it's hard to build a business, and there will be lots of things that you didn't expect. And so it's going to take time. So you need to have the resources to get through that startup phase and into the place where you're starting to generate a return. And then the the quote that we put up there, ignore your finances and they will ignore you. I've seen way too many entrepreneurs who don't really pay attention to their numbers. And sometimes the numbers tell you things that you don't want to listen to. Sometimes people just are, I think, afraid to deal with the numbers. But I think you always have to come back to the numbers and always be looking at them. And hopefully that will give you enough insight to start making adjustments. But having the resources to get through those startup phase, it takes a while and it is challenging.
We did have another a question. For those of you that didn't know about our webinar series, we always caption the recording and then we put it on YouTube and then we send a follow-up email with all of the links that we share in the chat, as well as a link to a PDF of the PowerPoint and the webinar recording link in YouTube to anyone that registered for the event. So if you're concerned about getting our slides, we will share them with the recording once it's captioned. We have another question. What is the reasonable rate of return when starting a small business? I think this is complicated, but do you have any insights, Steve?
Yes, it's very complicated, and part of it comes down to is what you need. And so that's why we talked about setting your own goals, understanding what's important to you. Um, if someone is just trying to make some extra income, maybe a couple $100 a week, um, that's going to be a different set of a return than someone who's going to be selling something and needs to have a certain amount of money to cover those expenses and maybe to pay an investor or a loan off. So uh, I don't tend to the term rate of return is something that I think gets kicked around a lot in the financial world. Um, in the small business world, actually, I don't hear too much about that. It's more, is this going to be profitable and how long will this be profitable? One of the things I will say is um, part of the reason why I like to do a cash flow projection is because um, it helps me see if a business is actually at least breaking even in an easier way. Still not easy, but it's an easier way to see it. And I think that going out for 5 years is worth taking the time to do. Um, and you can see returns over a longer period, but it is a challenge.
Well, and Steve, just from to add on to what you're saying, from what we've seen with personal finance, where people are they're a contractor, they're basically self-employed. There's a lot of income volatility in that type of lifestyle entrepreneurship. So, if you might look at rate of return based on a certain term, or maybe it's monthly or quarterly or annually, but there could be a lot of volatility in that. And so I think thinking about what your needs are, and thinking about cash flow projections and potential costs might be valuable too when you're thinking about that. We have another really good question. How do you know how to scale as a service-based solopreneur?
So and that is a challenge, and that's why a lot of people, as they start to grow, if they're successful, start to look at other ways because you only have so many hours a week you can commit to your business. And if it takes a lot of time, you're limited by how much time you have. So is it possible to find parts of the process that you can outsource or find others who can either do them or be totally responsible for or make parts to it. Um, but there are limits, and for some people who want to, scale and provide jobs to multiple people and stuff, sometimes uh, it's a way to look at um, expanding. But again, knowing what your long-term goal is, but yes, you will be limited as a service-based solo entrepreneur to how much you can do.
Thank you, Steve. I'm not seeing any other questions yet. If you do have them, you can put them in the chat. But again, I think we'll close up the webinar shortly. And if you think of the questions later, you have a better context for the question, you can email studentmoney@uillinois.edu. All right. Steve, did you get any separately or
Not that
privately?
I know of.
Okay, I haven't either. So thank you again for joining us and talking with us and being interactive. We always like the interaction. Again, if you want to learn more about this, I would highly suggest signing up for registering for the Venture Series with Steve so you can get some more in-depth questions answered. And we will go ahead and close up the webinar for today. But thank you again for joining us and have a fabulous rest of your afternoon.